I very warmly welcome Hoesung Lee, and I will talk with him about the future of energy transition and climate change. I'm very happy that we have you here. Mr. Lee, we are proud that we are able to talk to you. You are an economist, and you're the first economist to chair the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the scientific body that helps the UN to understand what climate change is about, what governments and people can do to fight climate change, to cut the long title short. Tell me, where do we meet you now? Is it morning? Is it night where you are?
It is the late afternoon.
Late afternoon. So for us, it's not late morning, not early morning, somehow in between. We are very glad that we can talk to you. Very briefly, tell me, most people in Germany, they might have heard about the IPCC whenever they hear news about climate change. What is the IPCC? I think for most people, it's still a rather mysterious institution. How does the IPCC work? Could you tell this our listeners in 2 or 3 sentences? What is the IPCC?
IPCC, yeah, I know that it's been, that name itself is very well known, but not many people really understand how the IPCC works. So very happy to receive this question. And the IPCC produces the reports on the science of climate change related to the science-based and its impacts and responses to climate change. The key activities of IPCC is carried by the scientists we call the lead authors. And they produce the assessment reports. They assess scientific literature, the hundreds of scientific literature on this both natural and the social science aspect of climate change. And they are nominated by the governments and also selected by the IPCC Bureau, which is about 34 members elected by the IPCC, considering the geography and also a range of expertise. And all these selected scientists are a volunteering their time and expertise for this independent, objective assessment of scientific literature. And then in addition to that, we have a very rigorous review stages, 3 review stages to guarantee the objectivity and balance and comprehensiveness of our report.
You're an economist, which is a surprise to probably most of the people who probably think it's physicians that work there, climate scientists. If my daughter would like to join the IPCC in a couple of years, what would she have to study? Is economics the thing that will help her, or is it rather natural science?
Well, as you know, the climate change is the symptom of every activity occurring on this planet and by the human, and therefore every science in the rather natural and social science are very much needed to understand properly these climate change problems. And therefore, if your daughter, for instance, wants to join IPCC in the future, then she must be knowledgeable in the areas of science related to climate change. And you mentioned economics. Economics is a very important area, along with other disciplines related to climate science, to properly understand the issues related to climate change. And therefore, we need to have a highly interdisciplinary input to properly conduct assessment of the climate change science.
Could you tell us briefly what the IPCC is currently working on? What will be the next big report? What's the job you're doing at the moment?
Right. Currently, we are in the process of producing what we call a 6th assessment report. And IPCC has been in existence 32 years now. And up until this point, up until 2015, we have produced 5 assessment reports. And this is the 6th assessment cycle. And in July this year, late July this year, we will be releasing with the approval, with the agreement by our member governments, one of the main reports related to the climate science. And then early next year, again, with the approval of our member governments, we will be able to release the assessment on climate impacts and then responses to the climate changes. And then in the later part of next year, we will be able to release the final part of the 6th assessment report that is known as a synthesis report.
Mm-hmm. Your findings are very important for the climate conferences that we had, and also the climate conference in November in Glasgow that we will be looking at. If you, I know it's almost impossible, but if you cut short the findings of the last 30 years, you said you have been working for 30 years. What would be the key message besides the fact that we have to fight climate change?
Well, there are many key messages we wanted to convey to policymakers, but I can summarize in a very several key words. And first of all, the climate change is already affecting people, ecosystems all around the world. And second, limiting that warming to 1.5 degrees, not impossible, but requires a great deal of unprecedented efforts. And 3, we found that there are clear benefits of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees compared to the 2 degrees warming. And also we found that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is comparable with our purpose of continue to have economic progress and social well-being. So it is very important that we should be able to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees.
Before we talk about the ways that we can, about what we can do to fight the climate change and to stay below 1.5 degrees, let's briefly focus on who's affected most. You already mentioned the people that are affected. It's also parts of nature that are affected. Where would you have us look at if we want to see already what's happening? Because we actually can see in some regions of this world probably what is going on and what will affect all people in this world if we don't fight against climate change. Where do we have to look at?
You know, the most unequitable aspect of climate change is that the people who are not responsible for causing this climate change are the people that are will mostly be affected. And the poor and vulnerable segment of the population are the ones that will be heavily affected by the ongoing climate change, and also climate change that will continue to appear in the future. And then sectorally, we have already observed the coral reefs are in great danger, and also the Arctic conditions are getting deteriorated year by year. So we really need to take early action to stop this ongoing warming. And we also observe that the rate of ocean warming is also accelerating. And all these impacts on ecosystems need to be moderated as much as possible.
We just heard that the Arctic is melting much quicker than we actually thought before. Why is this such a problem?
Well, the Arctic system is a very important component of the climate system. And any changes in one component in this integrated system, Earth system, will affect climate change in all aspects. And changes in climate affects all elements, all dimensions of our lives and livelihoods. That's including the life support system of life support services of ecosystems that we have from this nature.
One of the problems that I have read about is that when the Arctic is melting, sea levels will be rising, and this will affect lots of countries that have coastal areas and coastal regions. Is this something that we already can see also somewhere, or is it something that that will happen in the far future?
You know, the sea level is already rising, and even if we stop emitting CO2 at this moment, the level of warming will continue due to the accumulation of the CO2 in the atmosphere. The warming will continue, and the level of the sea level, the increase in the sea level will continue for many, many years to come. Again, that is the reason why we need to act immediately and rapidly.
So do I understand you correctly that this is affecting already regions, cities, coastlines, and that this will not stop even though we fight against climate change? Will we see the result in the Netherlands, in, let's say, Bremerhaven, which is a port city in Germany? Is it already that bad, the situation, that even though we do something, we will have to face these problems?
Well, region by region, I would not say that the specific region you mentioned is compatible with what the science has found. So I'm sure that the specific region is just one figure of example. So we know that small island countries are in great danger. Mm-hmm. And also many areas in the tropical area in danger, because the rate of warming there is quite a disproportionate impact on their lives, people's lives, as well as the ecosystems. I mentioned I mentioned that Arctic situations already, and also I mentioned the coral reefs already, and that's the reason why. In this cycle of assessment, we are developing a further understanding about the impacts at the regional levels.
Let's look once again at the real work of the IPCC. You have done reports on specific issues like the Arctic, like the problem of the oceans. Who decides what you focus on? And maybe I can add a second question. What do we not know yet? What reports are still missing?
Well, I think as far as scientifically concerned for taking immediate action, I know that policymakers know enough to take action today. And, the importance of IPCC work in the real world context, I think history has shown very well that our report has been instrumental in establishing a global framework for acting against the climate change. For instance, our first assessment report, which was released in 1990, was a basic scientific basic scientific information for creating United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Climate Convention is more or less a product of IPCC report. And now our second assessment report was instrumental in establishing a Kyoto Protocol. And fifth assessment report led to the Paris Agreement. And our last special report, that was a special report on the global warming of 1.5 degrees, led to many countries proclaiming a net zero by 2050. So our reports have been instrumental in getting a very practical policy conclusions and policy action. And in terms of real world context, our report clearly indicates what kinds of transition need to take for the next 2 decades or 3 decades. And if you look at the renewable industries, what's happening there was exactly very similar to what IPCC reports has been indicating for so many years, especially since our last fifth assessment report. And therefore, the relevance of IPCC work in the context of the real world is very high. And if you are in the business world, looking for the opportunities and promising areas 5 years in the row or 10 years in the row, I would recommend you to take a look at the IPCC report. The future is there.
I'm actually very happy to hear that, because I have to admit that I somehow have the prejudice that scientists can talk, but politicians quite often don't listen to you as much as you should. In fact, it's one of the slogans of the Friday for Future movement, listen to the science, and we quite often had the debate that politicians don't listen enough. As far as I understand you, without your reports, politicians wouldn't have moved as far as they do. So you would actually argue politicians and politics is listening to what we do. This is very interesting.
Well, certainly you can see, or someone else can see, the politicians do not listen to the science. But at the same time, you can also observe politicians listen to what science says. And I'm sure that IPCC has been contributing very well to a science-based policy decision.
We have our listeners have the possibility to send us questions. And one of the questions that I also hear quite often is that there is influence of the politicians in the way your reports are framed. How big is the influence of politics in the outcome of what you are doing and what you're writing?
I don't think politics has nothing to do with IPCC assessment process. I'm sure nothing to do with that. I mentioned about a very rigorous review process, and that review process is the process that guarantees the IPCC's objectivity and scientific integrity. Mm-hmm. And let me just give you somewhat specific about this review process. We have 3-stage review process. First is internal review among the lead authors. And then second stage is the expert review process. It is the open process to all the scientists around the world if they want to volunteer for that review. And for instance, if you're a daughter interested in some specific areas of IPCC report and having a proper credential, then your daughter can also join in this review process and expert review process. And then once the comments received from the expert reviewers, the authors are required to address all those comments. And then we have the final stage, we have expert and government review on our draft. And there again, we receive comments and then revise our draft based upon those comments. And all the comments were addressed by the authors, and the end result purpose is to elevate the as much as possible the scientific integrity of IPCC.
Maybe I can just tell you, maybe you have not heard in South Korea about it. We just recently had a judgment by the High Court in Germany, which took up the idea of that you in the IPCC developed that we have a budget, that every country has a budget, and probably every person should have a CO2 budget. And on the basis of this budget, they decided that the German government have to enforce their actions against climate change, that they can't leave the actions to the next generation, but that they themselves have to do something now. So this is probably also a proof that what you're doing is pretty important. But let me add a question to this issue. This idea that every country, that humanity has a budget of CO2, would you say that this is in the IPCC now common sense, and that most regions, most politicians, most governments in the world, they believe in this idea and they act upon it?
Well, no, the IPCC's special report indicates that to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees, we need to have a net zero emissions by 2050. Mm-hmm. That's the budget, net zero emission by 2050. That's global. That's global. So ideally, every country should be able to achieve net zero carbon neutrality by 2050. And that's the spirit of Paris Agreement. And every country now has agreed to submit what is known as nationally determined contribution, that is really the pledges for taking action against climate change. And that's in line with what IPCC reports have announced through its findings.
In the beginning of our conversation, you were pretty optimistic as when you said we can still reach to stay below 1.5 degrees. But then you added we have to do a lot of things, and you're an economist, so you have taught and you have researched a lot about what has to be done. So what has to be done to get this energy transition going in the world? Where do we have to speed up?
First of all, we have to increase the energy and materials efficiency a lot, so that there won't be much of energy being wasted in the future. And secondly, we need to be able to provide a clean, electricity. Clean means is less carbon footprint electricity to heat the buildings and to power the mobilities. And the next, we also should be able to capture the CO2s before it emits into the atmosphere, and then store and then to find a way to use that stored CO2. And then also we need to seek ways to improve, expand the use of bioenergy, and also to explore the ways to have a sustainable agriculture. That's important. And then ultimately, we need to have a foundation for a circular economy. So these are the really basic steps we need to take to achieve a carbon neutral world. But I must say that this is a transition as well as a transformation of the economy and society. But with it, I'm sure all of us would have new economic opportunities for a cleaner, sustainable world.
It's interesting that in the way you talk about the climate crisis is that you use more words like optimistic possibilities than danger, and I mean you much more on the optimistic side than on the pessimistic side. Is this just your nature as a human being, or is this something that you kind of have grounded in facts?
Well, the Fifth Assessment Report, as well as the Paris Agreement, made it very clear that the future is with the obtaining or working toward a net zero 2050. And therefore, going for the net zero world is nothing to do about someone's being optimistic about the future or not so optimistic about the future. This is the way that the society, I believe, will take, given the consideration of all the constraints that we expect from continuing business as usual way of, business as usual way of life, and also way of conduct our consumption patterns and related activities.
I would like to ask you one question that comes from our audience, which is, do you experience a change in political thinking because of the correlation of the pandemic and climate change? Have you looked into, or has the IPCC looked into that scientifically, or do you have any idea of whether there is a correlation, whether the pandemic in a way helped us to move quicker in our fight against climate change, or is it slowing us down?
Well, pandemic has occurred in the middle of our assessment activities, and our lead authors are assessing the literature, literature about this pandemic and climate change, and we should be able to say some findings about those results, but it's too early for me to say anything. Ongoing assessment activities, and our the results of our assessment will be available publicly once the government accepts the underlying report, as well as the approval of the summary for policymakers.
Let's, in the last couple of minutes that we have, look into the near future, meaning this year. Ever since the government in the US changed, and we now have a government that is kind of joined again the group of countries and governments that want to go ahead in fighting climate change, the mood internationally has changed. So what do you expect that should possibly and positively happen this year, running into the next big climate conference in Glasgow? What is the positive view of the next couple of months? What could happen, and what should happen?
Well, I certainly cannot predict what would happen in the future meetings. But I know what we wish from this IPCC community, and I believe also from the general scientific community. And it is very clear that that we need to act now. And those actions must be based upon science. And IPCC, the message has been very clear for taking immediate action to move toward the carbon neutrality by mid this century. I hope that the Glasgow meeting will be a very meaningful venue to move in that direction.
As I said in the beginning, most people probably underestimate the IPCC, and we heard from you, and you proved that it's quite an important organization. Would you say that the climate conferences are also underestimated, as my last question, or do you think they really move the humanity ahead?
Oh, I think those member countries participating in the climate convention have done marvelous work in advancing this climate agenda to produce a very meaningful outcomes. And the work is still in the progress, and I'm sure we should be able to achieve a good outcome from this climate conference.
Professor, I thank you so much that you joined our conference. It was great. Thank you so much for what you told us, and thanks more than for anything else for your optimism, because I think this is probably what we need these days. We need more optimism, and I recommend everybody who wants to know more to look at the web pages of IPCC. There was one comment from one of our readers, was actually a question who said, what can the IPCC do to help us to get this knowledge into the schools? Maybe you should think about a special web page for children. What do you think about that as my very final question?
That's a very good suggestion, and I'll keep that in mind in our future work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.